I call David Seymour.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, for this call. I was just working away in my office with the parliamentary channel on TV in the background, and I started to experience fear of missing out, or FOMO, as the younger people in the community want to call it. And I thought I must come down and make a contribution to this committee stage. Look, it's interesting to reflect on what the Minister in the chair has just said, because he seems to think that it's not necessary to require reviews as part of this legislation, as set out in a series of very fine amendments put forth by Chris Bishop from 76 to 79, because those reviews can happen anyway, and in some cases do happen on a broader sense of different organisations, such as the Electoral Commission and a select committee reviewing the election. But I think the difference here is that the Minister and the Chair, or at least one of his coalition partners, thinks that there is something ordinary about this legislation. And I think it's worth just revisiting why it might be that this committee would want to add additional requirements for review to this bill when they consider just how extraordinary this legislation actually is, when they consider the fact that this will make New Zealand an outlier in the world, that will be joined in having such a clause in its electoral law by only the kinds of countries such as, I think, Zimbabwe and a few others, with which Saudi Arabia, I think, what was the other one, Dr Smith? Pakistan. Well, these are not the kinds of countries with which New Zealand likes to compare itself. And I think it's important that if New Zealand is going to move constitutionally towards the kind of policy settings enjoyed by Pakistan and Zimbabwe and other places that have much lower standards of democracy and much lower standards of living than New Zealand, then, OK, if the House is going to accept that that is where we're going, then indeed it might be worth taking the extraordinary step of adding in a review. I'd go further. I think that there should be a sunset clause in this legislation, because here's another thing that makes it exceptional. This legislation is not exceptional just because it puts us in such poor company in the International Club of Nations. It is extraordinary because it really is the feature of one individual. Seldom does this House legislate for the convenience of one individual. It was interesting to hear what Andrew Little had to say about people coming in here to pursue their fantasies. Well, actually, this whole bill and its existence is about one individual pursuing their fantasies, with two other parties inexplicably, particularly in the case of the Greens, coming along for the ride.
But it's an attack.
It's an attack.
In the time that the member has left, I'd like him to address the review part of the Act as set out.
Mr Chair, I apologise if I'm doing that in a way that you find not direct enough, but I'm actually hoping to seek another call, because I've got quite a lot more to say in regard to new Section 7 and in particular the review. And I apologise if it's taken me a while to get to it, but I hope you'll indulge me, Mr Chair, because actually there is a transience in this legislation, and that is why it requires an inbuilt condition that it will be reviewed, because it is not legislation that is being done for the good of New Zealand. It is not legislation that is being done to make this country a better place. You see, Mr Speaker, reflecting back on what Andrew Little said, we are a representative democracy. It goes to the heart of our democracy that actually representatives who are people can change their mind and act in the best interests of their conscience once they come to this House. And furthermore, given that this legislation is only there because Winston Peters' track record of falling out with his own caucus. Mr Chair, Mr Chair, Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable
Mr.
Tim
Chair.
McIndoe.
Oh, it's outrageous.
What Mr Seymour had to say and endorse his comments, but I'm pleased to be able to return very directly